Hi, everyone. Welcome to our last research session by Maria de la Paz Chavez Vargas. I hope I spelled it the wrong way. Hi, Maria. I'm trying my best here. Okay. Sorry, I have camera problems. Sorry. Okay. So Maria is doing her PhD at the Latin American Faculty of Social Sciences. And as part of her doctoral research in sociology, Maria is conducting research on the concept of Indigenous women's political participation that have different levels of community autonomy. And she wants to find out how they define community autonomy themselves, how they participate politically, and what obstacles they have encountered in doing so. And I'm very excited for your presentation, Maria. And I will leave the word to you now. I don't hear you yet, so maybe you can unmute yourself. Perfect.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I will try to share the screen. I'm not sure. I'm trying to share the presentation, but I think I can. I'm only able to share the window of the internet. Do you hear me there, Anna? Can you hear me? I'm not able to share the presentation. I don't know why.
Maria, I can share the presentation for you. Just
please.
when to move the slides, and we can hear you. Okay, so let's go.
Thank you very much. But I wanted to share also the MAXQDA project, and I don't know how to do that. Because when I click on share screen, I only have the option of sharing let me see.
Yes, you can actually choose from different windows. Just try it out a little. Okay. Yeah, perfect. Okay.
Okay. Thank you very much. First of all, thank you for the invitation. And also, thank you to MAXQDA, because you are supporting my research with the research grant for young researchers. I'm going to talk about political participation of Indigenous women in different contexts of community autonomy. And first of all, I wanted to talk about my positionality in the research and why am I researching this. My name is Paz Chavez. I'm from Michoacán, a state of Mexico. And my family and all my father's family come from a town called Sevina, next to Cheran, which is one of the cases of my study. And we are Purepecha people. Purepecha people are indigenous people that live in the state of Michoacán and some other states. Right now, I'm living in Mexico City, but I've always been interested in my research about indigenous rights, and right now about indigenous women in political participation. And I will first talk about literature review. I will talk later about objectives and the research questions. But what I did first is to read about political participation of indigenous women, and we have about community autonomy level. We have two main ways of looking on political participation of indigenous women. The most important one in literature is access to public office through two ways. The first one is electoral system and political parties, and that includes popular election charges or office in the legislative, in the executive, and also on elected officials that are not elected but designated by other people who were elected. And the other branch talks about indigenous regulatory system. That, thank you to Leah that suggests me to use the translation of cultural habits and customs. That means that some indigenous communities have special laws. They can elect their authorities. They can administrate justice in their own terms, but not all of them. In the Federal Constitution of Mexico, we have this right for the indigenous communities that they can have their autonomy and their cultural and follow their cultural habits and customs. But each state of Mexico has to regulate this in their local constitutions. But few of them have special laws for that. For example, one case is the case of Oaxaca, in the state of Oaxaca, in the south of Mexico. Since 1995, they have their own cultural habits and customs laws, and they elect their own authorities by their own ways, and they administrate justice in their own terms, but that does not happen in the rest of Mexico. But now in the last years, there has been an interesting movement to autonomy, especially, for example, in places like Michoacán, where I come from, that have fought for the right of autonomy, and especially for the direct budget to the communities. So I was asking myself, how are indigenous women participate in these scenarios, and what is their role in all this, in this panorama? I don't know how to say it. And in the literature, when they refer to cultural habits and customs, they talk about community authorities, the participation of people in assemblies, the tenure, or if people hold religious office or charges. I don't know how to say that. And I call this branch of the literature the conventional approach to political participation, because it's like what we all know, or like the most commonly defined definition of political participation, like to hold to have access to public office mostly by the electoral system and political parties. And in the case of indigenous people, by their cultural habits and customs. But the conclusion is the same, almost always the same. This literature says that women are not participating. And although we have affirmative actions and we have positive discrimination, and that are measures that intend to make easier the participation for women, for indigenous women, it seems that it's not working as expected. But there's another branch of the literature that talks about different organizational processes that doesn't have to be with access to public office, but with the decision making from other spaces, like, for example, the participation in organizations, in networks, in movements, in the defense of the territory, the fight for the autonomy, when they have a gender agenda, dwelling, sale on public roads, for example. Well, I will talk about that later, and from rights of health, education, and some other rights. Here, the sale on public roads, it's like a special case for indigenous people, because here in Mexico City, it's a very different context, like compared to the rest of the indigenous community in the rest of the country, which are mostly living in rural areas. But here in Mexico City, it's not well, we have rural areas in the city, but it's the capital of the country. And here in Mexico City, we live people that talk 65 of the 68 indigenous languages of all the country. So you can imagine it's a context of migration, different from the community of origin where we come from. And it's a different dynamic, yeah, of participation. So here in Mexico City, many indigenous women participate through organizations that are fighting for the right of having a house here in Mexico City, or like for the right of sailing their products in the roads. So that's another kind of political participation. And I call this, that the access to public office and other organizational processes, the broad approach of to political participation. And in this context, my research questions are three. The first one is, what does political participation mean from the perspective of indigenous women who live in communities with different levels of autonomy? What are the ways in which they participate? And how is the level of community autonomy of indigenous people related to the political participation of women who live in them? And I'm interested especially in the first question, because we have defined they have defined political participation in different ways, but never taking into account the perspective of indigenous women. So when I said that the conclusions are that indigenous women don't participate politically, it's because we are measuring political participation in specific terms that not necessarily have to do with how indigenous women define political participation. And for the methodology, I am conducting a mixed method research, qualitative dominant, and then with a second phase of quantitative methods. The first phase is the qualitative one. I started with the literature review, with the review of secondary sources. I conducted semi-structured interviews and also participant observation. I have already carried out 30 interviews, some interviews in Michoacan and Cheranqueri, and some interviews in Mexico City. And this takes me to the second phase, which is the quantitative phase. And based on the semi-structured interviews, with the information that I've got from these interviews, I constructed a survey that my intention is to apply 400 surveys to indigenous women. I've already applied 203 in Cheran. I'm still working. I will start, I think, in the next month, the application of the other 200 surveys here in Mexico City. And my intention is to apply a structural equations model after the 400 surveys. And what I did is I used MAXQDA. I'm using MAXQDA in two sections. The first one is in the literature review, and also the second part is in the analysis of the interviews. So from the first phase, well, the qualitative phase, I as I said, I carried out some interviews, and based on those interviews, I constructed the survey for the quantitative phase. I also asked about community autonomy level, economical, political, justice administration, territorial and cultural perception of autonomy level in Cherán-Queri, and I will do it also here in Mexico City, and to see if the community or the Mexico City or Cherán has a low community autonomy level, medium or high. My intention initially was to do this research here in Mexico City, in Michoacán, in Cherán-Queri, and also in Chiapas, in a Zapatista community. But during the process, 1 year ago, I sent a letter to Chiapas, to the authorities, to different communities, but I was not allowed to go into the community to do the research because they have special restrictions for political reasons, for safety. And I had to stay with Mexico City and Cherán. But the intention is, well, the idea that I had is that Chiapas had a very high level of community autonomy level, Michoacán a medium level of autonomy, and Mexico City a very low community autonomy level because of the context. So what I wanted to see is how this community autonomy level affects the political participation of Indigenous women. And also there's another variable that during the literature review, I not discovered, but gender violence was present, as you will see in the project, in every in every paper that I read of political participation in indigenous women. And some literature says that because of the practice of cultural habits and customs, there is gender violence, so there's a low level of political participation of Indigenous women. What I'm proposing is to study how the community autonomy level affects the gender violence, if there's more violence, gender violence in communities with a high level of autonomy, or if it's in the other way. And also, I think the most important relation is how gender violence affects political participation of Indigenous women. And this will be the second phase, the quantitative phase with the survey and the SEM, the structural equation model. And what I discovered from the interviews, when I was constructing from the interviews the survey, is that social networks and support networks that women have are a very important variable for the political participation of Indigenous women. Literature already talks about social networks, but like in the interviews, it was very, very present. Indigenous women that participate politically have strong social networks and have like a network that supports her work, and not only their work, but also there's you will see later, a psychological component, very important, that affects the political participation of Indigenous women. And I want now to make a little stop to tell you how I am using MAXQDA. I already told you that I use it for the literature review. It's the first time I use it for that. And also I'm starting to use it for the translation of the interviews and the codification. I did a content analysis. I will show you a little bit. I used some visual exploration tools. I did coding, different type of memos, paraphrase, comments, and I used the research diary option that we have in the program, that it was very useful for me to keep recording or writing important things for me during all this research. And it has been very useful for me to systematize all the information, to find what I want to find, to have everything organized. It's easy for me to compare cases or papers in the case of the literature review. And also, it has been very, very important for me for methodological transparency. This is one of the things that I did with the codes. I'm sorry, they are in Spanish, but this is my code cloud from the literature review. And we can see that I had like some special criteria to select the papers that I codified with MAXQDA. And in red, we have like the obstacles and the all things that make women make difficult the political participation of indigenous women. And in green, we have the codes that talk about political participation, movements, organizations. And if you see, one of the biggest codes, or the most codified one, is affirmative actions, gender parity. And that's what I'm a little bit criticizing, because for indigenous women, this is not working. I mean, it's important, very, very important, the affirmative actions, but indigenous women are not getting into the public office. They have other ways of political participation. They participate politically in many different ways that doesn't have to be with this conventional definition of political participation. But the literature keeps talking about this way. And also what we see here is exclusion and inequality and patriarchy, intersectionality, violence, obstacles. And I will show you next, or maybe right now. Here you can see, these are the three like themes that I codified in MAXQDA. And for the papers of the selection of papers that I read, I codified 2,800 more or less segments with political participation, but half of them talk about obstacles that for indigenous women. And for example, here, and as you can see, community autonomy, we have only 64 segments codified. Nobody talks about the relation of political participation in indigenous women and community autonomy. And here I want to show you violence. It's not a high number of codification. It's only 52, but it's femicides. And I don't know, it's like 6 papers of the 21 that I selected talk about femicides in papers that are supposed to talk about political participation of indigenous women. If I don't know, if we search for papers that talk about corruption, I don't know. I think we won't find this. No, we won't find that they are talking about femicide, about gender violence. For me, it's impressive how much they talk about violence when they are focused on political participation of indigenous women. And well, I also divided the codes by the type of approach of political participation of indigenous women, and these are the 2 broad approaches: the organizational processes. 46% of the codes talk about organizational processes, and 54% talk about the conventional political participation. And of these 54%, 34 talk about political participation in the electoral system and political parties, and 20 about political participation in custom and habits of the indigenous communities. And some preliminary results. It's preliminary because I'm still I'm codifying the translations of the interviews. I'm still working on this. Is that we need to broaden the definition of political participation for heterogeneous citizenship. Indigenous women have not the same opportunity of political participation, of the conventional political participation as other women have, because of the so many obstacles and the intersectionality they face in the way of participate. And indigenous women conceive political participation in a broad way, and they distrust electoral system and parties. They exercise leadership in different ways, not only in access to public office. And gender violence is the main obstacle. This is not new, but it's very, very important. Also, this is some results for the second phase. I'm almost done. These results that I'm presenting during this section are from Cheran for the surveys, the 200 surveys that I have conducted. And for example, one of the questions is, if you wish to hold a popular election office, I don't know if it's the correct translation, how easy or difficult would it be? And almost 80% said very difficult or difficult. And the same question, but for traditional, if they wanted to be a traditional community authority, how difficult would it be? It's a little less than 80, it's 70, almost 70%, but it's still high. The answer are very difficult or difficult. And also obstacles are women who participate politically, single out, criticize, or are gossip and rumors generated about them. And this is always, almost always, and sometimes. This, I don't know if it sounds like a little weird for you, this kind of question, but each time in the interviews, the women that participated politically, they said, every time we participate politically, they are saying that we are cheating on our husband, that we are there because we have done some things with men. And it might sound like it's not important, but it's a psychological component very important that affects their participation. Many women decide not to participate because of that. And also, compared to men, do women work more on household chores such as washing dishes, cooking, ironing, cleaning? And as you can see, always and almost always is more than 85% the answer. More than 85% of women answer that they work much more than men in their houses, and this has to be with political participation because they don't have time to do other things, or if they decide to participate politically, they have to stop. They have to do the things at home and also participate outside. And finally, the psychological component that I told you about. When we ask, would you feel qualified to assume a position or a charge or to be an authority of the community? This is not at all, a little bit, and I feel some, I don't know how to translate it, a little more than a little bit. Because each time they talk about the obstacles, one of them is the lack of self-confidence in their capabilities, in their knowledge, and that's a very important component that that they take into account to participate. They say, I'm not prepared, so I don't want to. I'm not prepared. I'm not ready to be an authority. And finally, what lessons are learned from this? Well, the question, affirmative actions, are they being effective? the psychological component, the insecurity, the doubt about their own abilities that affect political participation of indigenous women, and participation in organizational, I didn't talk about this, but participating in organizational process offers tools to women that participate politically in more conventional spaces. I didn't talk about this, but women that organize in other spaces learn, for example, many things. Learn if they didn't talk in public, when they participate in organization, they learn to express themselves, they learn to use computers, they get some other tools that help them to participate in more conventional spaces. And still to analyze, I'm still doing that, the relation between autonomy and political participation of indigenous women in the quantitative phase. And thank you. I don't know if, can you hear me? Hello, I don't know if you can still hear me.
Hi, Maria. Can you see the chat section of your session? So when you head to the very right tab, Mara has a question for you. If you see it. I can try to read it for you, if that's okay.
Do you use MAXQDA maps option to create your theory about factors involved in your research? No. No, I didn't talk about, but no, I didn't use MAXQDA maps. I first did a preliminary literature review, and I tried to find some codes that could be that I could use for the literature review. But then, so I had previous codes, but when I was when I was reading the literature, I created some other codes, like for example, political parties. I did have the code of electoral systems, but for political parties, many of the papers talk about them, and I had to create a code for political parties. But I didn't use MAXQDA maps. And for the factors that involve the research, no, it was just like I thought about them before codifying and conducting the literature review. What is your definition of a segment? Is it in a sentence or phrase? Regarding the research, why do they distrust political parties? Segment is a sentence. I decided to codify each sentence because sometimes we had a paragraph that talk like a lot of times about violence, but different kinds of violence. and I decided to use like the sentence as unit of codification. And why do they distrust political parties? I think because of many reasons. First of all, political parties are not interested in indigenous women. There are a lot of patriarchal attitudes to women in general and also to indigenous women. And also because in the communities, they say, well, the political party comes and the candidate come and talk with us only when we have elections, and after that we don't exist for them, or because of corruption, because of many things, but principally mainly those of them. Thank you. How did I selected the interview partners? What roles do women have? Would you interview so far? For the interviews, I did a snowball selection, but I tried to select women that participate in both spaces, like in public office, but also in organizational processes. So, for example, here in Mexico City, I went to the Ministry of Indigenous People in Mexico City, and some of the authorities that work there gave me an interview, and also they shared with me some contacts to reach other people that participated in organizational processes. And also I knew some other because of my own political participation. And in Michoacan, what I did is it's a different context, completely different context. I present myself to the authorities. I present the project, the intention, the objectives, and in Cheranqueri, they have their own authorities. They have the most important authority of the town is called Consejo el Keri, el Consejo de los Grandes. And they are not, it's not only one person, it's 10 people. 5 of them are men and 5 of them are women. So I went to talk to them and I interviewed 4 of them, and they also told me about other people, other women in Cheran that participated in different ways. And that's how I did the selection. What proportion of the population are indigenous women? In Mexico City, of the population, in Mexico City, it's around all the indigenous people. It's like 6% of the population, and half of them, a little bit more than half, are indigenous women. And in Michoacan, in Cheranqueri, the proportion is 12% are indigenous people, but it's considered an indigenous community. The 12% is the people that still speak Purépecha, which I think it's a very restrictive way to define who is an indigenous people or not, a person or not. But 12% still speak Purépecha, but the whole community is considered as indigenous, as an indigenous community. Thank you. Can you explain more how you define your codes in your literature review? Did you use an initial list of codes, or did they emerge from both of them? I did inductive and deductive codification. I will see. I will share the. I used as I told you, the memos. I have memos for the documents. I have free memos and also memos in the documents, but I also have memos in the codes. So for the most important codes, not for all of them. I have like a long description, a short description, the criteria that of inclusion and of exclusion, some examples, the typical examples, and for some cases I have close but not, like examples that can be considered to be codified with this code, but they are really not. And and that's what I did with the codes. And I had already a list with the preliminary review that I did. But as I told you, there were some codes that emerged during the literature review. For example, these ones, the political parties, and especially, for example, political parties. Para mal means for bad. This is how I define expressions that indigenous women said about political parties, why they distrust political parties, and they were 45 segments that talk about 41 segments that talk about political parties, but like how they affect their participation. I think those are all the questions. I don't know. Thank you very much. And I forgot to answer what roles did women have. The women that I interviewed, some of them were authorities, community authorities. Some of them were had different kinds of leaderships. For example, women that work in the underground metro and the subway, helping other people to have the possibility to work there, selling things, because many people here in Mexico City, many indigenous people, work on selling things on public spaces. There are some indigenous women that fight for having a house here in Mexico City. In Michoacán, in Cheranqueri, there's another kind of organization. For example, young women are organizing now for a gender agenda and against violence, gender violence, and also for defending the territory. But it's not the case of Mexico City, because we don't have territory here in Mexico City. We don't have territory like they do in the rest of the country.